Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you wherever you are in the world. The Honorable Rector of Universitas Islam International Indonesia, Professor Komarudin Hidayat, distinguished speakers, participants, and ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Ridwan. I am one of the faculty members at the Faculty of Social Science and director at the Center of Muslim Politics and World Society in Universitas Islam International Indonesia, or we call it in English, Indonesian International Islamic University, or IIIU. It is a great honor for me to be a host and co-convener of this first symposium on Muslim politics and world society. This symposium is held by Muslim Politics Review and Center of Muslim Politics and World Society. I will let you know that Faculty of Social Science is making this symposium as an academic platform to bring together all scholars, researchers, and postgraduate students to disseminate and exchange their ideas, research, and studies on Muslim politics and world society. We will hold this symposium every year, or becoming our annual program at the faculty in the future. Again, I would like to express my gratitude for your participation at our symposium, and I hope you are always in good health and good form in doing your daily activities. Before we get started, I would like to invite the Honorable Rector, Professor Dr. Komarudin Hidayat, Director of Indonesian Islam University, or UI3, to deliver his welcoming remarks and officially open this symposium. Professor, time and screen is yours.
Terima kasih, Pak Ridwan. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. Well, let me begin by saying that we are extremely grateful and honored to have everyone in this symposium today, especially to our distinguished speakers for this symposium, Prof. Jim Piscatori. We have also Prof. Rili Rahim, Prof. Saiful Mujani, Professor Ahmed Guru, Prof. Greg Willy, and also Prof. Bridget West. Thank you for your participation. Our thanks also go to all the chairs and discussions, as well as the presenters for parallel panel discussion, both from Indonesia and abroad. It is, of course, impossible to mention them all here. Also, my thanks goes to all participants who attend this symposium, both on campus and through online webinars, wherever you are. Indeed, this first symposium is held fully through online. We hope that in the next symposium, we will hold in hybrid way at least, or a full offline meeting, should the situation permits, more particularly at IIIU campus, so you can see and visit the campus in person. In this occasion, I want to briefly introduce IIIU before explaining the importance of this 3-day symposium. The Indonesian International Islam University, or IIIU, is a state-funded university established on Presidential Regulation number 57 of 2016, signed by President Joko Widodo on June 29, 2016, with the status of a legal entity state university. The establishment of IIIU campus is based on 3 pillars, namely Islamics, global projection, and Indonesian national character. Therefore, IIIU aims at developing a future campus for the study and research of Islamic civilization in Indonesia as the largest Muslim populated country in the world through educational channel. Therefore, it is appropriate if Indonesia can soon become a reference for world Islamic civilization with a moderate and peaceful Islamic character. As a result, we will strive for IIU to become a center for the study of moderate Islam, middle ground Islam, which can be transnationalized to the Islamic world in other regions. In addition, we hope that IIU will become a showcase and window for Indonesian Islam to the outside world and become one of the most important channels for Indonesia's diplomacy to the international world. To achieve this goal, IIU has established academic program in the form of faculties focusing on religious and general subjects. Currently, IIU focuses on master and doctoral program implemented by 4 faculties that have been running, namely the Faculty of Education, Islamic Studies, Economic and Business, and Social Sciences. In the future, we will create more academic program at new faculties, namely Faculty of Science and Technology and Architecture and Arts. In the first year, the applicants who applied to study at IIU in total achieved 1,009 people from 59 countries, mainly from developing countries from many parts around the world. Following a strict process of selection, IIU has accepted 98 students. Some are international students from 20 countries. Since the second semester in March 2022, students have started taking offline face-to-face course on campus, after which some of our students had struggled to attend classes via Zoom meetings due to the pandemic. This year, IIU will again accept around 200 master students and 100 doctoral students for the first batch. And we hope that more and more international students will be able to come and study at IIU. We hope that when they finish their study here and return to their countries, they can introduce moderate and peaceful Indonesian Islam in their respective countries and become professional in the field they are engaged in. Distinguished guest speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen, today's symposium is held by the Faculty of Social Sciences at IIU, which has the mission of providing a special academic program that combines an understanding of political development in Muslim societies and rigorous training in political science and research methodology. One way to achieve this goal is to regularly hold symposium, which is planned to be an annual program in the future. The symposium briefly aims at bringing together academics, scholars, and postgraduate students at home and abroad to present the existing research and current studies in the field of Muslim politics and Muslim society. Also, this forum is aimed at building partnership and networking among the symposium participants. The theme raised in the symposium is Muslim politics and world society. We know that in 1996 and also the revised version of the book in 2004, Dale Ekelman and Jim Piscatori, we have here, published the book entitled Muslim Politics. In this book, Prof. Piscatori observed at diverse political actors in variety of settings involving competition and bargaining in which political Muslim especially pursue ideas and symbols identified as Islamics in voicing their claim and countering claims. Today, more than a quarter century after the book was published, there is an urgent need to reflect on the theme with the various fundamental changes that have occurred in the Muslim world and new challenges to be faced. Again, there is currently fundamental change in the Muslim political landscape. For example, the Arab Spring, the rise of the post-truth, and the COVID-19 pandemic era are some of the thumping changes that have occurred. This theme is relevant because the phenomenon of Muslim government and society have undergone many changes, and cases involving political Muslim are widely discussed. This symposium involves several notable speakers from abroad, which I have mentioned at the beginning of the speech, and in parallel discussion involve 25 scholars, researchers, and postgraduate students from home and abroad, for example, from United States, Australia, Asia, will present diverse research topic related Muslim politics, which can see from the program that has been distributed. The output of the symposium, selected, well-written, and research presentation will be published in the Journal of Muslim Politics Review and other publications. To close this welcoming speech, I would like to thank the Dean of Social Sciences, Philip Vermonte, PhD, the head of the Politics program, Sirajuddin Arif, PhD, and all lecturers and staff, as well as everyone who helped prepare this event so that it can be carried out properly. Finally, by reciting Basmalah, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, allow me, officially, I open this symposium. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor, for your inspiring welcoming remarks. We hope that this university can become one of the center of excellence in the world in the future, as you mentioned in your opening speech. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, now we are going to the first Zoom webinar of this symposium. I'm very excited to be a chair for the first webinar with two distinguished and prominent speakers, Professor Greg Philly and Professor Bridget Wells. As you know, and you read in the program schedule, the topic of discussion at this occasion is researching Muslim politics. When we are talking about the Muslim politics, I believe that there are some questions across in our mind. For example, why do we need to do research on Muslim politics? What areas of Muslim politics today compare with the past? As Pak Rector mentioned in 1990s era, when Eichelman and Piscatori published their books and its revision in early 2000, and what kind of methods that can be used as analysis tools in studying Muslim politics, and so on and so forth. I believe that there are some questions that can be discussed further in this occasion. Without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, Professor Greg Philly. We are happy to have you here, and also Professor Bridget Wells. Before that, I will read his bias. Greg Philly is Emeritus Professor of Indonesian Politics in the Department of Political and Social Change at the Australian National University. He gained his PhD from Monash University in 1998 with a study of the history of Nahdlatul Ulama. He published many books, publication. I would mention here at least two of key publication. First is Joining the Caravan, the Middle East Islamism in Indonesia, Radical Islam and Terrorism in Indonesia, and Zealous Democrats, Islamism and Democracy in Egypt, Indonesia, and Turkey. Regarding the academic career, he has been a visiting professor at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is chair of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trades, Australian Indonesian Institute. Okay, Professor Greg, Prof. Greg Philly, you have 15 to 20 minutes to present your thoughts on this topic. Time and screen is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much, Ridwan. And I have a PowerPoint. So hopefully, if I click on that, it will come up. That's good. So that looks okay. Okay, so thank you very much, Pak Ridwan, for your introduction, and also to Pak Komar for his wonderful introductory remarks. And it's very good to get some of that background on U3I, on the UIII. So, as you mentioned, I have about 15 minutes, and what I wanted to do was to discuss, what I really wanted to get to is a discussion about what might be good areas of research on political Islam. But in order to do that, I wanted to give a brief global context. And I'm not an expert on global political Islam, but I do try quite hard to read as much as possible of the literature that is produced on this. So hopefully that gives some context for what I will then go on to say about studies of Indonesian political Islam, because clearly one of the objectives of U3I is to be able to connect with broader research going on in the world about, in the case of this faculty, political Islam. So let me begin by this very brief global overview of political Islam, and I don't want to go back too far in history. If we just take the last decade, 15 years, 10 to 15 years, it's a common view amongst commentators, amongst political scientists specialising in Islam. This has been a period of decline. At the beginning of that decade, as Pak Komar mentioned, we had the Arab Spring, which led to the ousting of multiple authoritarian regimes, the introduction of democracy, and in particular, we had various Islamist parties that were able to either come to power or share power in their states. Best known of which is the Muslim Brotherhood Party in Egypt, where Morsi became president. We also had Rashid Ghanouchi's Ennahda Party in Tunisia. In Morocco, we had the BJD as well. And of course, as everyone knows, the Arab Spring very quickly became, in most countries, the Arab Winter. And this turned out to be a very short-lived triumphal period or success period for Islamist parties. So Morsi, of course, was removed in a year, and the Muslim Brotherhood was exposed to the most savage repression that it had ever experienced in its long and often very repressed history. Ennahda itself initially withdrew from leadership position in government, and of course we've now had an authoritarian turn in Tunisia and the abolition of a democratic system. And even in Morocco, although PJD remains an important party in government, it is nonetheless subject to the dictates of the Moroccan king. So it's not really a party with the freedom to implement its preferred policies. On top of that, we also have the very zealous anti-Islamist, particularly anti-Muslim Brotherhood campaigns conducted by Saudi Arabia and also by the United Arab Emirates, which has had considerable impact not only in the Middle East, but in other parts of the world. So on top of those developments, we've also begun to see, or we've seen further developments in what many scholars have referred to as a transformation that is underway in political Islam, a transformation in the way in which political Islam is being conducted and in the kinds of language, vocabularies of political Islam that are being developed. And much of this, and I'll talk about this in a moment, is a move away from what we would regard as classical style political Islam through parties and seeking control of government to trying to capture some of the energy that we find being developed in the personal sphere, in the private sphere rather than in the public sphere, and the way in which people connect their personal piety to a vision, an Islamized vision for what kind of society and indeed what kind of nation they want. And so that's a different register for many politically active Muslim organisations. So that's a brief overview, global overview. Very briefly, many of you listening to this will know a great deal about Indonesian political Islam, but let me give you my thoughts. The past 15 years has really been a period of stagnation and centrism, where there's not been a great deal of dramatic change in Indonesian political Islam. For the last 3 elections, so going back to 2009, we have seen the Islamic Party vote stalled at around about 30%. There's just a brief graph, and you'll see these last 3 election results here have all been roughly in that 1/3 of the total national vote. And this stable Islamic Party vote is happening at a time when almost every expert believes that there is a surge of Islamization happening in society, and it's been happening for many decades, but it has not happened for political Islam. So there are various explanations of this. One of these explanations, I think quite persuasive, from Sunni Tanuwijaya, is about the diffusion of the so-called pious Muslim vote, the Santri Muslim vote, not just across the political spectrum, this spreading of the vote across the political spectrum. If we went back 40, 50 years ago, pious Muslims usually voted for overtly Islamic parties. NU, Muhammadiyah, when NU was a political party, not Muhammadiyah, sorry, Masyumi, 2 good examples, or Qamusi. But now, pious Muslims can vote for all sorts of parties that may be partly Islamic and partly all sorts of other things. They might be actually quite complex amalgams. And so less than half of this supposedly pious Muslim vote goes to Islamic parties. We have some survey research on this, and most of this suggests that one of the main reasons is that voters don't think Islamic parties have good economic solutions, and nor do they have managerial credibility. The voters give Islamic parties high marks for their Islamic ideology, but not for their economic management. So basically, these voters are not convinced that Islamic parties will make Indonesia a more prosperous and stable state. And the last thing to mention here is that the sole Islamic party in Indonesia that we could call serious, to be a seriously ideological party is PKS, the Prosperous Justice Party, which takes its inspiration from the Muslim Brotherhood. And it formally announced Islamism back in 2008, and it overtly pursues a centrist agenda. And so this is what we see is the gathering together of most parties, including the Islamic parties, in the centre of the political spectrum where they believe the most votes are to be had. And one of the things they've done is progressively shed their Islamic identity in order to maximise their political appeal. So I think one of the things for us to discuss, and this will be very familiar to some of you, have been the shifting definitions that we now find in Islamic studies about the definition of political Islam. in classical terms, political Islam was usually focused on formal processes and institutions, particularly at the state level. It was about parties, it was about lobbying, it was about mobilisation influence, but it was all about trying to capture governmental power and being able to pass laws and to make policy decisions that the parties, the Islamic parties, felt reflected Islamic principles. So the success or failure of political Islam was dependent upon how successful they were either in elections or in elite power sharing arrangements. In some countries, we had military coups or we had military-based regimes that would invite collaboration with Islamist parties. Not common, but it has happened. So that is the kind of classical model of political Islam. But over the last couple of decades, we've seen a growing trend towards looking at more diffuse forms of political activism, and particularly in social spaces, in informal spaces, rather than in formal and institution state spaces. Much more work looking at associational networks, looking at voluntary or informal grassroots groups, and how these kinds of groups that might come together for a religious purpose link up to political parties. And we've seen some of these Islamist parties in recent years have been quite successful at mobilising people using these social spaces, not using traditional political spaces. And so people are looking at, scholars are studying the way in which new frameworks are being created by this interaction between political forces and these social forces. And we see that this trend towards personal pietism, towards individualisation of pietism, is flowing through to visions that the community may have about public morality and public order. And in the longer term, those visions of public morality and order can benefit overtly political players. I hope that makes sense. Related to this also is this debate that's been really raging, I suppose, for almost the same period, 15, 20 years, is this debate between Islamism versus post-Islamism, and whether we actually have a distinct stage beyond Islamism that a lot of formerly Islamist parties now find themselves in. So, I mean, everyone knows the traditional definition of Islamism was a label attached to parties or individuals who are pursuing Islamic law and Islamic law norms as the basis of the state or as a formal part of the state. For post-Islamism, there are a variety of definitions of this, but I think we can generalise them into being that this indicates groups that have either retreated from or abandoned the more formalistic, exclusivist, Sharia-based agendas that we associate with classical Islam, and instead have become more inclusive, collaborative with other groups, both other Muslim groups, but also non-Muslim groups, also become more flexible and more norm-based. Rather than talking about Islamic law, they talk about Islamic principles more generally. And this is a process. This is partly a reaction to successful repression of Islamist parties in many parts of the Muslim world, but also it's due to an awareness that Islamist parties, when they've gained power, haven't been able to make effective use of it because they've been too rigid. So closely related to this post-Islamism issue is the matter that I discussed in the previous slide, and that is this shift from collective to individual-centred Islamic consumption and activism. And so we get less focus on the public domain and much more focus on the private sphere. And we find these newly pietistic Muslims, particularly young or younger middle-aged Muslims, are asking questions about how can Islam improve my life? How can it give me greater certainty? How can it make me more successful, wealthier, and bring certitude? So the way in which these kinds of sentiments in the Islamic community can be picked up by these more open sorts of supposedly post-Islamist parties, things that might offer quite a rich area of research. This is allied, there's a lot of literature here. We have Carrie Wickham's notion of Islamist auto-reform, and also other scholars have written about the inclusion moderation thesis. And the whole tenor of this is that if Islamist parties are in power, sharing power, or have the prospect of sharing power, there is a learning process that takes place. And part of the learning process is there are benefits from being flexible, from cooperating with other groups in the political system, from accepting the system as it is, rather than confronting it, than seeking to change it in a way which is more absolutely Islamic. So this is all part of the more kind of blurry categorization that takes place under post-Islamism. So, so let me just touch on a few ideas for new research on Islamic politics, and most of these relate to Indonesia. So the first thing really follows from what I've just been saying. We need to look at the broader ecology of Islamic mobilisation, not just formal political parties that campaign during election campaigns and appear on TV networks for the debates and things like that, make speeches in public, but rather how social networks and associations connect to these Islamic forces. If we take a practical example, the most fascinating one was the anti-Ahok protests in the Pilkada, Jakarta of 2016, 2017. And we don't fully understand, well, I certainly don't fully understand, and I've yet to see a scholar that's given a comprehensive explanation about the mobilisation that took place during that time, how we could get the largest ever protest on the streets of Jakarta, and it happened very quickly. But we know anecdotally there were all sorts of networks, mosque networks, there were Sufi networks, there were, NU, Muhammadiyah sections were also involved in mobilising people, but also pietistic networks, people who were connected to particular preachers who weren't a member of any organisation at all. And they all responded to the call. There's something about this particular conjunction of events which resonated with them. And so this was an interesting event because in my perception, the political parties, the Islamic parties, followed the public mood. They did not lead it. And they sought to exploit that. We certainly saw PKS at the last election, with help from FPI and other organisations, sought to increase their vote. They did quite well in that election. So this is a really good example of a different kind of political mobilisation than the classical one that we're used to seeing. Related to this as well is the role of prominent preachers. And I have the example here of UAS, Ustad Abdul Somad, by far the most popular preacher in the country. LSE polling from last year, he was many points ahead of the next nearest person. He's not a member of a political party, but he most certainly plays a political game. And he has an ability to shape community attitudes on all sorts of things that are relevant to politics, whether it's contending something, opposing a government principle on something, or showing preference towards a political leader or party. So the role of preachers as political players, not directly but indirectly, that's also, to my understanding, very poorly understood. Another thing that interests me is, they're talking about these social spaces, is the role of, for want of a better word, Islamist schooling, which is usually not badged overtly as political. So we get these, STE there and these integrated Islamic schools, very professionally run, often quite high fees, good quality education, but they're run by organisations that do have an ideological agenda. And they are producing new generations of socially conservative, ambitious, upwardly mobile people. And how does this feed longer term into the prospects for political Islam in Indonesia? Another topic which I think could be very interesting is, and I think is understudied, is the role of Sufi groups in political mobilisation. I've heard some of the smarter political thinkers in Nahdlatul Ulama say that one of the three big pillars of political mobilisation in their organisation is the tarikats. And we know that in every election campaign, every serious presidential candidate visits Habib Lutfi bin Yahya, the most important Sufi leader in the country. He's on the Presidential Advisory Board. He has extensive links into state institutions, into security bodies, into the private sector. He is a pivotal figure. And yet, as far as I'm aware, there's been no searching study of what the basis of his power is and how this is mobilised for political ends. Because Prabowo, Jokowi, SBY, all those other people who visited him believed that he could deliver votes. They wouldn't have wasted time visiting him otherwise. The last thing, and Maaf, if this is a little bit sensitive, but Pak Komar mentioned in his words, in his opening remarks, but I also see it mentioned constantly whenever Pak Jokowi or Pak Ma'ruf Amin mentions U3, it's usually in the same sentence as the words moderate Indonesian Islam. I would hope that one of the things, and I'm sure it will be the case, that U3 does, is even though this is part of its mandate, it will also critically engage on this issue. Because it's very easy to say Indonesian Islam is moderate. But as scholars, we need to be able to establish that that is true or substantially true, rather than just accept it or repeat it. So how can we do that? To begin with, what is moderate? Is it a universal definition of moderation, or is it a specifically Islamic one? So one aspect would be, if Indonesian Muslims, the great majority, oppose the rights of gay people, of LGBT people, is that illiberal, immoderate, or is that actually complying with an Islamic definition of moderate? And if you take that definition to the rest of the world, will they accept it? So this is problematic, and this has to be brought out into the open. Attitudes towards Shia and Ahmadiyya. NU is always saying we're a very moderate organisation. Well, a lot of NU people in East Java are strongly opposed to Shia and want them banned. NU supported the partial ban on Ahmadiyya. When was that? 2005. On the religious rights of kepercayaan, whether that is even to be regarded as a religion. If that right is not supported, does that still make mainstream organisations in Indonesia moderate? So I'm not saying that it's wrong to regard this as moderate, but I'm rather saying that Indonesian scholars and anyone studying this subject has to be very clear in spelling out what this contains, because otherwise someone can come along and say, well, in fact, it's not moderate, it's a very narrow definition of moderate. Another thing that could be done is to compare the international survey material, and Bridget Welsh may talk about this because she's very involved in this quantitative data. But you can look at the Pew surveys and the World Values surveys, and it shows on some matters, Indonesians are very moderate. Things to do with gender equality and the like, Indonesia is very good. But a whole lot of other things, interfaith dialogue, for example, interfaith marriages, Indonesia, opposition to Ahmadiyya and Shiism, Indonesia is one of the least tolerant countries of the Muslim world, if you trust these figures. So it depends what kind of material you're using. And also, how do we measure the discourses in Indonesia and the record of action? What sort of things are important? Okay, we get sometimes attacks on Ahmadiyya villages, but there are hundreds of other villages where Ahmadis live in peace. So how are we to measure levels of intolerance? I think the other thing that needs to be studied is what is the political agenda behind the promotion of moderation? It's clearly become an important commodity in Indonesia's diplomacy, but that doesn't necessarily make it true. What is the intellectual content of key pillars of this moderation? So Islam Nusantara and humanitarian Islam, both of which have been promoted by Nahdlatul Ulama. We also have the Islam Wasatiyah initiative that Din Shamsuddin led a couple of years ago. So are these truly inclusive, moderate documents? Sometimes when I read the statements of NU people and I talk to non-NU Islamic leaders, I get the impression that Islam Nusantara excludes other Islamic organisations from international representation of Indonesian Islam. It's about Javanese Islam more than anything. It's about the kind of Islam which NU has, rather than Jamiatul Wasliyah or Muhammadiyah or Nahdlatul Watan or any other organisation that you want to name. So again, that may not be true, but the impression is there. So are we questioning these things? Also, there's a very interesting literature in recent years questioning how well the promotion of moderate religious values works, whether it actually changes anything in the world. And one person who's done very good scholarship on this is Elizabeth Hurd from the United States in her book, Beyond Religious Reform. And she asked questions about why are certain kind of groups picked up globally as voices of moderation or voices of Indonesian Islam, rather than other voices. So at the moment, it's very much NU, Yahya Stakuf to some extent, but Din Shamsuddin, small number. She says there's a privileging of particular Islamic voices going on here. There are assumptions and there are also interests that lay behind this. And people have to be very wary of what those interests are. If I give you just a recent example, I know I have to finish. Humanitarian Islam Gus Yahya Stakuf recently has been praised by RSS and BJP politicians from India. RSS is one of the most Islamophobic organisations in Asia. It has a terrible record and very well documented record for sectarianism. The risk is that sometimes well-meaning humanitarian documents, manifestos, can be used by people who are not ecumenical, are not in favour of interfaith dialogue. They have a political agenda to discredit Muslims in their own community. And that's the risk. These things can be manipulated by other forces in a way that actually doesn't promote moderation. So these are all things that we must look at. My final slide, and this is the last thing, we have a rise in political science in recent years of the popularity of quantitative surveys, quantitative study. And I just want to make a final appeal for the continuing need for deep political ethnography. It's good to have the big data sets. They tell us lots of things that the qualitative data can't find out. But we also have need for the human dimension. And that's where we need people who go and do interviews, who observe things closely, find out, go into these social spaces and find out why people are drawn to particular kinds of politics. I'll leave it there. Thank you. My apologies if I have gone too long, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Philly, for your enlightening presentation. We learned a lot from your speech. Ladies and gentlemen, the second speaker today is Professor Bridget Wills. Before she delivers her presentation, I would like to read her brief bios. Bridget Wills is a senior research associate of the Hufeng Center for East Asia Democratic Studies of the National Taiwan University and a senior associate fellow of the Habibie Center. In September 2019, she became an honorary research fellow with the University of Nottingham's Malaysia's Asia Research Institute. She analyzes Southeast Asian politics, especially Malaysia, Myanmar, Singapore, Indonesia, and other countries in the region. Her most recent books are entitled Regime Resilience in Malaysia and Singapore, and The End of UMNO, essays on Malaysia's former dominant parties. And she has published on a wide range of issues from women and gender in politics to conflict and international relations in Southeast Asia. The last thing I want to read is her dissertation at Columbia University, examine the relationship between state power, political rights, and revenue extraction in colonial Malaya. Professor Wells, time and screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Ridwan, and salam to everyone. Yeah, when you're listening to coming after Greg, it's always a very big challenge to have the conversation, and just to see you all makes me rindu Indonesia very much, and I'm looking forward to when I be able to come back and visit in that context. I took my task a little bit different than Greg, and I've really enjoyed his presentation because I think it provides a very good, succinct discussion of some of the important areas of research, contemporary now, and the transformations. What I tried to do is to kind of open up the conversation without a PowerPoint, which is unlike me. I always have PowerPoints, and also to talk about things more broadly and kind of and so the keynote remarks focus on how I see Muslim politics generally changing in world society. And what I've tried to do is to come at this not just from my work, which is looked at, it's very modest in terms of looking at Muslim politics compared to Greg's. My attention to Muslim politics has been a product of looking at Malaysia and Indonesia, where I have to, when you recognize the need to look at Islam and the impact of Islam on shaping power, and have to sort of, and as a consequence, I've looked at the role of Islam in issues of women's participation, political parties, elections, electoral data, and so forth. But I've sort of wanted to try to understand, and I think it's important for us to understand, how the study of Islam and the study of political Islam is changing and it is evolving. And so in this regard, I've identified for these remarks sort of three questions. Now, first of all, what does it mean now to talk about Muslim politics? I mean, what does it mean now compared to the past, right? The second question is, what are sort of the major research questions, not necessarily in Indonesia, but how are they changing? And that builds a little bit on Greg, but in a slightly different way. And the third question I asked is, why is the study of Muslim politics important? Why do we need to keep doing this? Why is what is happening at IIIU important? And why is this journal essential for the future? So let's take that first question, the meaning of Muslim politics. It's interesting. If we look and we do research on this label Muslim politics, the first major scholarship comes in the 1990s. It's almost 30 years old. It is actually a term that has been used in the West. And I think this is very important because I'll come back to this in a few moments. It's always been, to a certain degree, this idea of Muslim politics has been this idea of an other. Muslim politics versus non-Muslim politics. And, you know, we see there are 1.8 million publications in English and multiple millions outside in other languages, but which, by the way, don't get the credit that they deserve and often have very important elements of the conversations and points of understanding. When we look at that body of research, we see essentially, I would say, 5 major themes. And the first of which focuses on this idea of the relationship to democracy or authoritarian rule. This is quite pronounced in most of the scholarship. We see attention to identity politics, the role of Islam in elections, mobilization, political parties, things that Greg highlighted in some of the ways, although he much went further. We see, interestingly enough, the status of Muslim minorities. And this, interestingly, has gotten a lot more attention in terms of in recent work, such as on the Uyghurs, such as in southern Thailand, and Mindanao, and the Philippines, and others. The role of gender and gender analysis and the empowerment of women, and then the areas of extremism and violence. These are the 5 dominant themes. And all of them have looked at Islam and political Islam as with various different sets of lenses. What we've seen is that there has been a recognition of greater complexity and pluralism in the research. But they have most of the research comes from a place of respect of Islam, but in fact operates in a world where there's considerable disrespect for Islam. So it's very interesting to see how these things create in this nexus. The other kind of, when we look at the body of literature, we also see much more multidisciplinary research compared to the past. This is another important trend. Initially, the conversations about Muslim politics were focused predominantly in traditional political science, very narrowly. Now we see this extending into anthropology, into sociology, into religious scholars. And I think it's evidence when we look at this symposium, this first symposium, we're seeing some parallel discussions of the multidisciplinarity. And when Greg just a moment ago talked about the importance of different methods, I think it's also important for different framing associated with interpreting those methods, which we can see as things moving forward. And so when we ask this question of what it means, we see the study of power in Muslim societies, the study of the differences of what is Muslim societies versus non-Muslim societies. And of course, the reflection of the primacy of the West in its lens of looking at the other, at least in the initial part of the literature. What we see in the last 30 years, there has been three important shifts of what Muslim politics means. The first of which is that Muslims are now defining Muslim politics to a greater extent than before. This is extremely important. Instead of it being defined by Western scholars, we are seeing the debate being shaped by a more interactive, more exchange of ideas. And I think this is an important trend. A good example of this would be the work and the book by Leonard Sebastian and Sheikh Hashim and Alex Arifanto looking at rise of Islamic conservatism in Indonesia that was published last year. This book, the majority of scholars were Indonesian, from Indonesian voices. And I think this is a very important trajectory, a change that is happening. The second important debate, trend that we've seen in this kind of meaning of Muslim politics in terms of the literature, has that there has been now a kind of a shift to incorporate historical literature and Islamist debates and texts. So previously, the way people looked at Islamic politics and Muslim politics came at it from trying to understand the power dynamics that were happening with the rise of Islamic parties, the debates over democracy. But there was almost like an ahistorical assessment of the nature of power. And what we've seen in the scholarship is now to connect to existing sets of debates and discussions. And I think this is an important evolution to incorporate historical intellectual traditions. This was not as prominent in places, the divide between the contemporary reality and the past in Indonesia, but it was particularly prevalent in the places like the Middle East. And so I think what we've seen is that this has also empowered more Muslim voices in the debate and discussions about what Muslim politics means. And the third kind of trend we see is that the attention to Muslim politics is now incorporating all of the Muslim world, not just the Middle East. We see more attention to Indonesia and to Malaysia and to Turkey and other parts outside of the core elements of what the focus has been because of the predominance of the initial lens being highly westernized. The second big question I asked is the issue of what research questions are there. And I think what we have found that the work, the two main questions in the literature have focused on democracy and violence and conflict. These are very interesting and very important questions, but I think they also have changed in very interesting ways. The decline of democracy in the West as well has been a particular important element of why there has been less of an obsession to look at the kind of lack of democracy in the Muslim world. I think that, while I agree with Greg that the failures of political Islam and the problems in the pluralism and the changing nature of political life and complexity of political parties in the Muslim world and the stagnation that he talks about is also present, I also would say that because of a dynamic of looking at Muslim politics from the West, the changes in the West have also shaped how they have viewed Muslim politics. And we see, in some ways, the othering of Muslim politics is less of an other now. When we see authoritarianism, exclusion, and forces that have kind of been labeled on the Muslim world, in the Western world, it questions us to re-examine as scholars the intellectual roots of these things in very interesting sets of ways. I think what has been interesting to me in terms of looking at the questions of democracy and exclusion has been the focus in particular on the role of the struggles that Muslims faced as minorities. And these issues of minority politics and identity politics, I think, if we look at the body of scholarship, have taken on more prominence than the focal points of violence and democracy in recent scholarship. And here we see some very interesting work on the study of the Uyghurs, for example, in China, the attention to different forms of political mobilization that Greg was speaking to, the changing nature of the diversification of Islamism. I recently gave a debate and discussion here in Malaysia, and I was presenting this to a Muslim Islamist party, and I was pointing out that we now have in Malaysia a buffet of Islamism. We have different choices that people can make because of the nature of the individual choices, the nature of a more complex, a more diverse Islamic political life, not only at the personal level, but at a sense of also at the political level. And so what's interesting, however, is that while the debate in the literature has evolved and become much more interesting and more multidisciplinary, the fundamental research questions have not really kept up with the changes taking place in the society. And I think this is interesting when we see Greg lay out a whole series of sets of interesting questions. I feel that the literature and the theoretical debates have yet not taken us to those areas yet, Greg, in this context of the research questions. So let me close by looking at the last question of why it is important to look at the issues of the Muslim politics in terms of the contemporary environment. I think it is critical to extend this pattern of evolution of ownership of the discussion of Muslim politics among the voices of Muslims themselves. The importance of a place like IIU as a center for knowledge is critical because there needs to be more synergy, more understanding, more scholarship that creates exchanges from the Muslim world itself. That speaks to what is happening in the Western and the scholarship and vice versa. We don't have enough of these exchanges because I would say Muslim political research has actually also faced a stagnation and in terms of attention elsewhere. We need to have a stronger voice of the Muslim world, given the attention, the global realities that the large share of the world is in the Muslim South and North, and there has been inadequate, I think, appreciation of the importance of what is happening in these societies. And I think we need to continue to emphasize and to expand and to diversify. And finally, I think that from a scholar who looks at these issues of what's happening to Malaysian politics through multiple research methods, ethnography, interviews, and survey data, the realities on the ground is that there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of complexity. We can't really understand it. So the Muslim politic lens provides us a way of understanding the nexus between values, faith, and power. It allows us to to understand the different trajectories in different sets of ways. It allows for the creation of knowledge. And I think as a consequence, in terms of my remarks, if we need to have a more robust, particular analysis of Muslim politics. And in this regard, I will point to 3 areas of research that I think are pretty critical moving forward. One is a continuation of the work from a gender lens, to look at the area of politics from the perspective of masculinity, femininity, and changes on issues of women in particular. This scholarship tends to be compartmentalized, not inculcated and not brought in any meaningful way. The second area is to look and draw attention to the experiences of minority Muslims, which are very different than that of and majority societies. The level of insecurity, the level of experience that they have to go through, I think are particularly different. And the concept of minority is not just a population minority, but also sects or communities of different elements of faith in that area. And the third area that I would highlight is to unpack the values that are going in the Western scholarship, to challenge some of the stereotypes of Western scholarship in more meaningful ways, to break down the othering of Muslim politics as we move forward. These are my short remarks. They're a little bit different from our orientation than Greg's, and I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Wells, for your interesting and inspiring remarks in your presentation. And we have more or less 15 minutes, and without further ado, I would like to invite some question from panelists. If you can raise your hands, and then later on I will read a question in the chat box. Please raise your hand in. Anyone? Or I will read the questions first. There are 2 questions. This question goes to Prof. Greg Philly. In your recent article, Jokowi in the COVID era, repressive pluralism, dynasticism, and overbearing state, you argue that the government is not to genuinely protect and respect the diversity of doctrines and association in Indonesia, but rather to constrain it by narrowing the range of permissible expression. The question is, how do you see and elaborate the term of repressive pluralism to describe this phenomenon? Is there any critical perspective on this term? And the second question is goes to Prof. Philly as well. How do you see the repressive policies of state toward the political Islamic group, including some Muslim figures in Indonesia in these recent years? Is it a sign of the increase of Islamist influence and threat to secular politics, or is it only the part of pragmatist politics played by the current political elites in Indonesia? Professor Greg's screen is yours.
Pak Greg, you are still muted.
My apologies. I should know better. So thank you, Pak Ridwan, and also thank you to the 2 questioners. They are similar questions, and so I'm glad for the opportunity to talk a bit more about this issue of repressive pluralism. And this is something that I wrote, I don't know, was it 3 years ago now, 2 years ago? And the whole idea of repressive pluralism was that the government was cracking down on particularly Islamist groups in the name of pluralism, that it was arguing that Islamist groups threaten pluralism, and therefore the safest thing that Indonesia can do to guarantee diversity, kebinekaan, and the like is to restrict or ban Islamist groups. So we know the two best known ones are Hizb ut-Tahrir and also Front Pembela Islam. But there are lots of other actions that took place apart from that. Prosecution of Habib Rizik, threatened prosecution of lots of other Islamic leaders as well. So it seemed to me as if we had a paradox where pluralism was being used to, in fact, restrict the range of political expression. And my argument was that this was being done for two reasons. One, I think there was a genuine philosophical objection to Islamism, but secondly, there was a political motive, and that this kind of Islamic activism posed a significant political threat to the ruling coalition, to the Jokowi coalition. So that was 2 years ago. What about now? Well, in the last week and a half, we've seen Khilafatul Muslimin. We've seen many of its leaders arrested. We've seen a string of comments by senior security officials from BNPT, from Polri, setting out the reason why they are banning, or not banning, why they are conducting these arrests for this organisation. And all of this worries me, because it seems to me that there are not strong reasons for those actions, that this is an excessive response by the state. Now, the government hasn't put this in terms of pluralism, but nonetheless, this seems most definitely a repressive action. And I think if we are going to take action like this in a democracy, if large numbers of leaders of an organisation are to be arrested and questions are asked about their future activities, you have to be able to prove that these organisations are a threat. Is it sufficient that an organisation emphasises Khilafah? Is that sufficient in Indonesia to suddenly arrest people and to talk about membubarkan organisasi? Because Khilafah is not a proscribed word. The only movement that is proscribed in Indonesia is communism. So we have this problem where action is being taken against groups for using a term that is not illegal to use. And as many of you will know, the word Khilafah is used in lots of Islamic organisation documents. It used to be in the PKS platform, if I remember correctly. It is in Sufi documents, constitutions for tarikats and the like. So I worry that this is being instrumentalised for a political purpose. So I suppose to come back to this, I think the phenomenon is still continuing. I know a lot of people object to my use of this term. I've been labelled kadrun and all sorts of other things for doing this. So be it. But to my mind, these kinds of actions, the banning of Hizb ut-Tahrir, FPE, the jailing of Munawan on terrorism charges, when his only real crime was to be among hundreds of people who were at a large event and swearing allegiance to ISIS. Well, if you're going to convict everyone that did that, you would have a great many people behind bars. So I think this kind of action has been successful in repressing Islamism, but there's a warning. And many of you will know Don Emerson many years ago spoke about Suharto era repression of Islamism. And he said it was like a nail. And the harder you knocked the nail into the wood, the deeper it went. So the nail was still there, And it will eventually come out. And it might come out in a much more radical form, if I can mix my metaphors, than what it went in. And so all those groups who think they've been unfairly dealt with, and I think they have been unfairly dealt with. Habib Rizik, the only person sent to jail for a breach of public health regulations, as far as I'm aware. Special rules seem to apply for these Islamists. So that is a problem in a democracy. Sorry, I won't talk for too much longer. And the second one, part of pragmatic politics, I think it is pragmatic politics. I think there is a philosophical element to it. There is a normative element where people like President Jokowi, Ibu Megawati, lots of people in PKB, NU, do not like militant Islamists. But nonetheless, in a democratic system, they have a right to exist unless they break a law. And if they don't break a substantive law, well, then you should be very reluctant to ban them. I'll leave it there. And thank you again for the questions.
Thank you, Prof. Philly, for your answer. And now I would like to invite Pak Philip Permonte and then followed by Haris Samputra. Please ask your question or comment briefly. We have a limited time. Thank you.
Yeah,
thank
you. Thank you, Pak Ridwan, and thank you, Pak Greg and Bridget, for the two great presentations. It's a great panel to start this symposium. You certainly, both of you, set the tone for the symposium for the next 2 days. My quick question to Bridget, you're speaking about decentering narratives of Islam. Now, scholars talk not only about Middle East, but rather Islam in Southeast Asia and other parts of the world. Now, my question is, in what way Islam in Southeast Asia is unique to the whole narratives of Islam and politics? If I may get your insight on that.
A very important, a very interesting question. I think there are three dimensions. Number one, I think it's the relationship between the periphery and the center, right? And how Southeast Asian Islam interprets what is pious, what it means to be Islamic from the center. It's that particular relationship, I think, is a very interesting one, and it's evolved into traditional ways. People interpret it as a kind of a Saudi Arabian interpretation or particular different aspects of faith, but it's much more complex than that center periphery relationship. And it is also, it's not just about faith, it's also about business ties, it's also about organizational ties, intellectual ties that I think definitely need lots more impact in investigation, but that dimension of being in the periphery. The second aspect of Southeast Asian Islam that I think is important is the need to accommodate different minority communities or to work in a more pluralistic environment. This, I think, is an important difference than what we see in parts of the Middle East. And the third important aspect is that at least in Malaysia and Indonesia, you have a much more open political environment. And despite, I think, the important remarks that Greg made now about some important red flags that need attention to in terms of the arrest of individuals and the lack of democratic practices, and we have similar dynamics that are taking place in Malaysia as well. I would say that what we see is a much more open political environment, and we see the implications of an Islamic politics that is changing as a result of a more open political environment. And I think that is these are three important reasons from my perspective to include Southeast Asia beyond the numbers and the reality that Southeast Asia has the largest Muslim population in the world and other factors that I think also make sense.
Okay, thank you, Professor Wells. I invite Pak Haris Samputra. If you can ask your question briefly or give your comment, please. Pak Hari.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, please, yeah.
Assalamualaikum. My name is Hari Samputra from Global Future Institute and Inaya Foundation. Let me start with my point of view and question with 3 hashtags. Okay, digital. Okay, the first one about Islam politics. The first hashtag is soft power politics. Second one is institutional structure. And the third hashtag is transnatural relation. My point of view about power, soft power politics, we know that as a history in Indonesia, Islam comes from trading, social empowerment, and so forth and so on. And so soft power is the main dakwah, the main transform the society at the time. And I think because we talk about soft power, we talk about the transnational structure, actors. Yeah, we know that multinational social corporations like Global Wakaf, Global Zakat, so more prosperous way of politics, in power politics. No, not the old Indonesian paradigm that power politics is about taking power, taking a place in the government. It's not about that. So my point is about institutional structure. More and less, we come back to the historical Islam in Indonesia. So that's what Pak Greg's about moderate, about the middle of paradigm in da'wah, in spreading the Islamic way of ideological, political, social, and other thing that within. About transnational actors, or Pak Greg said about khilafah and stuff. It's we are rahmatan lil alamin, transnaturalists. It's beyond globalists and beyond nationalists, and it's a peaceful and a noble way of ideological politics. I mean, we don't have to have a secret political agenda about that. I mean, we try to be integrity, having integrity, services, leadership, adaptability, market. It's all same. We are all the same. We talk about competency. We talk about capacity building, and we are all in Islamic way. That's what.
Pak Hari, we take your point. Can you stop there, please? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Pak Hari, very much. I really appreciate. And then the last question for this session, Pak Sirajuddin Arif, please.
Okay, thank you, Pak Ridwan. Thank you, Pak Greg and Bu Bridget for your insightful presentation. So my question is, I try to be short. So how do you think the study of Muslim politics should accommodate the recent development in global economic changes? So to make it, to put it in perspective, you see that there has been huge variation in terms of economic structure across different Muslim societies, from traditional to modern one. And when you talk about the shift in the Islamic studies, you see that most of the Western scholars, I assume that the way they think about religion is influenced by the way the religion has been developed in the West. while now the situation between the West and the East is different. That's the first issue. The second point is that now the recent development in terms of the global economy, the effects, say whether it's about climate change, whether it's like capitalism, somehow most of the Muslim people are small actors rather than big actors. The main actors in terms of climate change should be in the big corporation, for example. Late capitalism also, the big players are the big corporations. So, the extent of these actors certainly will affect the life of not only Muslim but all the people. So, how do you think the study of Muslim politics should include these aspects into the research agendas? Whether we should think that Muslim politics should only talk about, say, Muslim mobilization or something related to that, but how to, if we would look to address this problem, how do you think we should address them? Thank you.
Okay.
Sebentar, sit down.
Yeah. We are first.
Unmute.
Yeah.
I'm quick. We're quick on this. We keep remembering. Sorry. Both these questions, Bahari's comments just now and your questions also speak to something that I think is critical, is that we have an empowerment in the Muslim world that is taking place that changes the power relationships vis-a-vis not only the West, but vis-a-vis internally. And when we talk about economic forces and economic transformations, ultimately, this means that we have to rethink the type of frameworks and the way we understand things. When Greg spoke about Liz Hurd's work about privileged voices, which is a very important study, I think she already is highlighting some of the kind of power dynamics, but doesn't necessarily fully inculcate the economic dimension that you were speaking about, Ciro, just now in that context. So how do you go about doing this? Well, I think number one, we have to adopt different framing, right, and recognize different framing of these sets of questions, and specifically, embrace the question that you've just asked. How do economic dynamics transform the interactions of Muslim politics? And we have to study this from different sets of dimensions. It is, the usual framework that people have used is class politics and, say, the conversations of Malaysia, lower class dimensions and the upper class dimensions, but they don't look at the broader structural economic changes within the country or the major shifts of power relations vis-a-vis the Muslim world and other countries. So we have to start beginning by asking those questions. And I wish I had more of an answer for you than that. But what I do feel is that I think, it fits into the broader theme I was trying to emphasize, is that we have a power shift, where the shift of power is moving to the Muslim world compared to the past, because the dynamics of power are shifting not only in the economy, but in the nature of the way the global world the West has declined compared to other parts. So in this regard, we need to have different frameworks to begin to look at those questions. And by focusing on the economy, we can begin to offer different insights. Let me give you a very interesting illustration of what I was trying to capture here. So Patricia Sloan, she's an anthropologist, has done a very interesting study of the role of how Islamist behavior has impacted the business community and the changing nature of the work environment. So she used the particular lens of looking at business and the economy to understand the kind of power relationships in the workplace, including gender dimensions in her analysis, subsequent articles as well. So I think, by taking the questions in a different way, we find different answers. And that's sort of a short answer to your question. I'm sure Greg has more to add on it because of his knowledge on the literature.
Okay, go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, Ridwan. Thank you, Bridget. I'm not sure I do have a lot to add. They were interesting questions. For Hari, I think it's true when you talked about different forms of transnational interaction. So you mentioned about global waqafs or global zakat. So in Australia at the moment, there are several branches of Dompet Duafa. that have been opened. There are Islamic banks that I think also have some connection back to Indonesia. We have a couple of Muhammadiyah schools, I think, that are now open in Australia. So in a way, this is soft power. This is a different presence of Indonesian Islam in an Australian setting. There are only about 20,000 Australian Muslims of Indonesian descent, not many, but we have a large and rapidly growing Muslim community, and organisations like Dompet Duafa actually have quite a marketplace that they can appeal to. So I think that's right. This is changing some of the nature of relations. But when you spoke about Indonesian Islam as Rahmatan lil Alamin, of course that's true. But what does that mean? I know people who have a moderate disposition say this captures my benign view of the world. But there are also lots of people in Indonesia who are much more unhappy with the place of Islam in the world. They want it to be different, and they have a more demanding, a more militant agenda. Not that they advocate violence or harm to anyone, but they have a much more conservative agenda, perhaps. So they may not be in favour of gender equality, they may not be in favour of sexual rights or minority rights. But those are all part of this rich diversity of Indonesian Islam. So I worry a bit when we say that Indonesian Islam is represented by concepts such as, Rahmatan lil Alamin or Islam Nusantara. That certainly represents part of it. But I don't know that every Muslim in Indonesia, or that not substantial parts of it, wouldn't feel excluded from that view. So that's my concern about that. And about the changing economic structures globally, of course, we know the amount of capital generated from Gulf states, which is now has major Islamic economies in countries like Singapore and London and New York, as well as, of course, in Jakarta. Every time there's a sukuk bond, very heavily subscribed. So we can see the role of the economic power of sections of the Muslim world. Unfortunately, very limited sections of the Muslim world. But we can see how that changes the nature of relations with the Western world. We know that President Biden is going to visit Saudi Arabia, and he's going to meet Mohammed bin Salman, even though he clearly strongly dislikes him. Why does he do that? Because he needs some of those economic resources that Saudi Arabia has, particularly its oil, in a Ukraine context. So this does give power to the Muslim world, and it also gives resources that the Saudis, for example, can use to spread a very conservative message of Islam, a Salafist message of Islam throughout the world. So I think it's true, this economic dimension is a very important part of the analysis. I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Philly, Prof. Wells. Considering the limited time, and we have two more parallel panel discussion after this. So I would like to thank you again for your contribution. And if I may, can we give virtual applause for Professor Philly and Professor Wells. Thank you again, Bari Sating, Hamdallah. I would say Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Okay, just a little bit announcement that to all the participants, you can choose the panel if interesting to your passion or your related to your study. Okay, again, we will close this first session of webinar. Good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, Pak Greg.
Thank you very much, Pak Greg.
Thank you, Pak Greg.